It's only been a few months since the passage of Bill C-18, Canada's controversial Online News Act, which is now law and is scheduled to come into effect in December 2023. Finally, however, the much anticipated implementation regulations have been announced by the federal government. So these regulations relate to the amount of compensation Canadian news outlets would receive from online players such as Meta and Google. And the criteria for the compensation model seems to rely on the number of full time journalists an organization employs. Smaller news outlets, understandably, are crying foul. Compensation aside, we are already seeing the effects of C-18 here in Canada. With Meta announcing it would not allow posting of links to Canadian news stories, Canadians are trying to find, I guess, a different way of obtaining news than they are used to. Perhaps the first negative impacts of C-18 was experienced by those fleeing the wildfires in the Northwest Territories. Remember that? Residents have since expressed that it was really hard to get information on evacuation with Facebook and the likes no longer sharing Canadian news. So think about it. How often do you head to Facebook to find out what's going on? So, what can we expect with these new implementation regulations for C-18? What further actions might Meta and Google take? And how are Canadians adjusting? Well, joining me now to share his expertise and views on this matter is Peter Menzies, a former vice chair for the Canadian Radio Television Commission, the CRTC, who's also an author and a senior fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Peter, thank you so much for coming on today. Appreciate your time.
Thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure.
Excellent. So maybe give us a little bit of a quick refresher on what C-18 is and explain to us the new proposed guidelines.
Yes, Bill C-18 is the Online News Act, and it's based on the unproven allegation that big tech companies unfairly profit from the carriage of links to news stories and to news sites. That argument was made with some success in Australia, a very different political environment there a couple of years ago during the height of the pandemic. Canada thought, hey, that's a great idea. We'll jump in too. Newspapers started promoting the idea when it looked like it was going to get some wheels. Broadcasters jumped in, and people started having some really wild ideas about how much money they were going to get out of this deal. I've heard talk that some of the backers were thinking they were going to get like $100,000 per journalist, which is, I think, more than they pay most of them,
Wow.
which would have been great for them, maybe not so great for the public. Anyway, at the end of the day, Facebook and Google, Meta really, which owns Instagram as well, have rejected the premise of the argument. And I think the news companies themselves have failed to show that that back that up with proof. Anyway, the end of the day is Meta has gone home on news. It is not going to play, and it will not carry news links anymore.
Yeah, and
And
they made that
I,
announcement, I believe, in June 2023, I believe it was.
they made it last October. Really, they said if you don't change this, right? If we can't get, that there's a flawed premise behind this, and there's a number of problems they have with it, and uh, nobody believed them, and they didn't really get a say in the process or weren't consulted in the process, and I think they made the decision about February that they would leave, and they've left. And I don't think they're
Um,
coming back. I mean, all things are possible, I guess, but I think they're done, and they're done internationally too.
wow. It just, when people have been conditioned to kind of obtain their news in a certain way and share news and share news links, it's really hard to change the habits of the viewership. So really, the readership, I think, is really going to be impacted here. The Canadians who obtain their information that way. We recently the government recently released its much anticipated regulations as to how this new funding model will work. We only have about 30 seconds before commercial, but could you just start us off on that discussion as to what you think of these new
Sure, the
regulations?
legislation is about what you're going to do, and the regulations are about how you're going to do it. So what they've done is they've fixed a price, which they thought would make Google and Facebook happy, and they've fixed what their cost might be, and they've come up with some ideas and fixed the percentage that you dole out, like who gets what. That's a whole other conversation.
Okay, well, we're going to have that conversation when we get back in just a few moments.